I'd also like to acknowledge the Nahiawak, the Anishinaabe, the Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota peoples, as well as the Métis people on whose treaty, traditional, and homelands I live and work. And what that means for me is recognizing that we're in an ongoing process of colonization, and that it's important for people who are settlers like me to think about ways in which we can participate in the process of decolonization and reconcile and implement the true spirit and intent of treaty based on Indigenous ways of knowing. So tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about some research that we've done on the City of Regina's Renewable Regina motion. I'll introduce that in a second. But I want to start by talking about the need for an energy transition. So the latest IPCC report, which came out in 2018, the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, basically boils down to that we have about until 2030 to decrease our emissions by 45% below 2010 levels. And we need to approach net zero by 2050 if we want to have any chance of keeping global warming to around 1.5 degrees Celsius or below 2. And that's a conservative estimate. So that's the sort of premise for the talk. I start from that position. The idea being that we need to transition off of fossil fuels, all of them, and we need to do it by at least 2050, hopefully sooner. So in some of my work, as Sean has mentioned, I've been looking at Saskatchewan's oil economy, and more recently we've been looking more at questions of transition. How can we transition? And especially in provinces that are arguably petro provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta. When I moved back to Saskatchewan in 2009, there were no academics really looking at the topic of oil production, and all eyes were on Alberta, and for good reason. Alberta's tar sands are very emissions intensive. Those projects need to be wound down if we're going to have a hope of keeping global warming to anything reasonable, anything that we can continue to live under. But something that I've been arguing is that, and some of my colleagues, we just submitted a paper, it's more of a commentary piece called No Paris Without Saskatchewan. So one thing that we've been trying to argue is that it's impossible for Canada actually to meet its Paris targets, which are even less ambitious than what the IPCC report tells us we need to do. So it's impossible for Canada to meet its Paris targets without Saskatchewan doing something. And so if you look at this graph, these two graphs, for example, you can see that Saskatchewan's per capita greenhouse gas emissions are astronomical compared to other provinces, both within Canada, but also other jurisdictions around the world. In fact, they're some of the highest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in all of the world. And this is a problem because, again, if we care about Canada meeting its targets, you can see there on the right that actually this graph is showing Canada's Copenhagen Accord targets, which we missed. That we were on track in Canada in a number of provinces to meet those, but that Alberta and Saskatchewan basically together, their rapid increasing rise in emissions associated with the oil and gas boom that has been taking place and is stalled now, but has been taking place over the last 15 years, has basically wiped out any of the savings that have been made in other areas of the country. So you can think again about sort of the politics that are playing out on the national stage right now, and the ways in which, if you are even Ontario, Quebec, the maritime provinces, what kinds of feelings you might have towards Alberta and Saskatchewan about their greenhouse gas emissions. And so the argument that we make in the paper is that, yes, the tar sands are really important in terms of phasing out, but actually Saskatchewan's greenhouse gas emissions are significant within Canada, and there's no real way to meet those Paris targets without also reducing our emissions in Saskatchewan. and phasing out oil and gas. And this is another way of thinking about it. This is from Environment and Natural Resources. In 2016, the oil and gas sector nationally and the transportation sectors were the largest greenhouse gas emitters in Canada. Oil and gas alone contributed 26% of national emissions, just from the production of oil, not from burning it for a productive purpose, just from the production of it. So if you put that together with some of the consumption of it associated with transportation, now we're at more than 50% of total emissions across Canada. So there's just simply no way to meet any kinds of climate targets without phasing out fossil fuels. And that's an argument that I have made and will continue to make for Saskatchewan as well. And according to the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers 2018 crude oil forecast, fossil fuel corporations actually plan to expand their production by 33% over that day's 2018 production by 2035. So CAP is projecting that Canadian crude oil production will increase by 1.27 million barrels per day to 5.86 million barrels per day by 2035. So at the same time as we know that we need to reduce our emissions, if we're taking the latest IPCC report, 45% below 2010 levels, at the same time as we know that, the oil and gas industry is actually projecting that they're going to increase their production by 33%. So these things are incompatible, right? And I think that we can see now nationally in the conversations that are playing out that there's a reckoning right now with those incompatible goals. And it's playing out in some interesting ways, I think. In the interest of moving on, I will get towards the renewable Regina part, but I did want to just start by telling you about potentially 3 different approaches to transition. So if we accept the premise that we need to phase out fossil fuels and transition to renewable energy, then there's the debate about how is the best way to do that. And one of the 3 approaches I would characterize as green capitalism or ecological modernization. This is the approach, for the most part, that the federal government has taken, tweaks to the system or tweaks to markets that allow for more investment in renewables, imposing costs on consumers so that they'll make the right choices. So economists love these schemes, right? Carbon taxes. Well, just incentivize people to privately in their individual lives make the right choices through carbon pricing. Here, there's a focus on the demand side. In other words, those who are consumers of fossil fuels, we're targeting our policy towards you as a consumer. Okay, so anything that is going to incentivize you, whether that be incentives to retrofit your home or disincentivize you, things like a carbon tax, the focus is on individual consumers as the demand side of fossil fuels. There's also an emphasis here on technical and technological solutions, and we can see this at the University of Regina. Where there's been a lot of investment into finding ways to be able to continue to burn coal and produce fossil fuels, right? So now there's this idea, we were the pioneers in carbon capture, which when it's working properly only sequesters 90% of the emissions. We know we need to get to 0. Coal is fairly high in terms of greenhouse gas emissions intensity, so 90% is still too little. And so now we're thinking at the U of R, there's research into, well, if we burned biomass alongside that coal, sequestered it all, and shoved it underground, then we could maybe get to some net zero, because of course biomass sequesters carbon from the atmosphere. The other part of that loop is they're actually using it for enhanced oil recovery. So they're using the carbon to actually push out more oil from aging oil fields. So you can see how these sort of fantastical solutions are really expensive, risky, and being invested in significantly by both the federal and provincial governments. The role for government in these approaches is to send the right signals, both to capital and to consumers so that they will make the best choices and decide and invest appropriately. The idea in the sort of green capitalism approach is that we can continue to grow indefinitely. We can even continue to grow the consumption of our energy as long as we transition to something renewable. And the assumption is that the phase out of fossil fuels will naturally sort of follow electrification and investment in renewables. So that's one approach, and I would characterize that as the federal government's approach. There's another approach that academics who study the topic are trying to put forward, not just academics, but also think tanks and global movements, and that's a sort of supply-side policy approach. Here, the focus isn't on the end consumer of fossil fuels, it's on the fossil fuel producers. And the idea is that since these folks are responsible for about 70% of historic emissions within the world, that it's time for them to pay up. So the focus is on making the producers pay. It uses policy tools like bans and moratoria. Those can start with not just outright bans on all fossil fuel projects, but it can start, for example, with bans on offshore or bans on fracking or no-go zones where you would have specially protected areas that are removed from oil production, for example. It regulates and taxes industry. So again, the focus is on the producers, making sure that it is unfavorable. The environment is unfavorable over time to producing more oil. So we know that Canada subsidizes right now the fossil fuel industries heavily. So the idea is to reduce fossil fuel subsidies, increase regulation and taxes on industry, and in the process manage a decline of the fossil fuel industries in a sort of orderly manner. The assumption about growth here, people are all over the map who are contributing to this literature and these movements about whether we can continue to grow under these scenarios and whether we can continue to consume more energy in the process. But simply put, if we think about the kind of even implications for space of renewable energy, the footprint of renewable energy, if we think about even just the space implications of that, if we're going to continue to grow globally our energy consumption, because renewable energy is not as dense of an energy source as fossil fuels, we need an awful lot of space just to install all of that technology. So there's smart people who are interested in the numbers working this out, but it's not at all clear whether we can, sort of grow in this scenario. And then another approach to energy transition is one that I would characterize as climate change, using climate change policy as an economic and as a tool for economic and social justice. So this is a graphic note that our friend Chelsea Fluke, part of a graphic note that our friend Chelsea Fluke took at our Just Transition Summit that we held in Regina in 2018. And that's Simon Enoch and myself at the top advocating for a 3D transition. And what we mean by that is a transition that isn't just about decarbonization. So the first approach that I talked about is really about decarbonization. So it would include decarbonization, but it would also include a focus on democratization. In other words, wresting our economies, our workplaces, and our environments away from a small group of elites that are enriching themselves off of them. And a focus on decolonization. So how can we use climate change policy in order to sort of reorient the structures of power which currently govern our society? And in this approach, the idea is not just to replace carbon capital with renewable capital, but actually to radically sort of restructure our economies in the process. And what does that look like? It means that redistribution has to be at the center. of this. In other words, one thing that we're seeing south of the border, resonating really strongly with the Bernie Sanders campaign, is the idea that the rich need to be taxed, that they've gotten away with too much over the last 40 years, and we need some recalibration there, we need some redistribution. Or we can think of it in terms of decolonization. Nick Estes wrote a fantastic piece in the Jacobin in 2019, looking at a red deal instead of a Green New Deal. He talks about a red deal. And in the red deal, he asks the question in this article, why is it easier for some to imagine the end of fossil fuels but not settler capitalism? Radical calls by Green New Deal advocates for 70% tax on the wealthy or seizing the assets of fossil fuel corporations. Why not returning the land? And so we're trying to understand climate change policy as potentially the tool that can be used to think about how to restructure the economy, and in the process also redistribute not just wealth but land and jurisdiction back to Indigenous people. So the idea in this approach is to make marginalized and working class people's lives better. So if we think about perhaps one of the reasons why the it's complicated, but one of the reasons why carbon taxes haven't been seen very favorably across North America, not just in the West here in Canada, is that they're understood by people as costs to their lives, right? As something that they have to give up. In order, we don't even know what the benefit is, right? Certain people are still running the economy. They still seem to be making out quite well. And now we're being asked to give up more. And I think that's a sort of common understanding of the carbon tax. And in this approach, the idea is like, how can we actually use climate change policy not to impose costs on people, but to actually make their lives better? So we know that there's a lot of poor and working poor folks who are actually in positions of energy insecurity. They actually don't consume enough energy in a certain sense. They might have cold homes, etc. And the idea is that we can use climate change policy in order to actually deliver real gains for those people, and in the process really bring them along to climate change policy and to the movement. So Matthew Huber, who I'm a big fan of, is a geographer who talks about how to better redistribute and decommodify energy costs and infrastructure in the process of transition. And finally, under this banner, we could think of just transition, both as a framework and as a principle. And just transition is basically an approach to environmental policy making that aims to minimize the impact of environmental policies on workers in affected industries and communities, and to involve those workers in decisions about their livelihoods. So that would be as a framework, but as a principle, it's basically not to leave anyone behind. Now, somebody like Nick Estes would say, well, many people have already been left behind in the current carbon economy. So part of our task is not only to not leave anybody behind, but also to bring people into our economies in a good way. So that's the spirit, this last one, climate change policy as economic and social justice, in which we conducted our research. And I should say here too, like the Green New Deal kind of fits under this banner, right? So how can we use large-scale state resources to invest in universal programs that benefit people, and at the same time roll out an energy transition? Obviously, you know, with the Green New Deal, if you've been following that south of the border, and there is some interest in that in Canada as well, that is really conceived at a national scale with huge job guarantees and the idea of rolling out massive new infrastructure. We're looking, and our research looked at this Renewable Cities motion, and obviously the scale at the municipal level is much reduced, their jurisdiction is reduced, their powers are reduced. But while we have sort of inspiring examples about Green New Deals, not just from the US, but from around the world increasingly. What we've seen at the federal level in many countries is actually a failure of policies. So I think we could say on Canada's front, although there have been some things that the Trudeau government has introduced, we're not on track to meeting any of our targets. And there's this fractious politics between the Trudeau federal government and some of the provinces. We're not in a good place. There are barriers that are imposed by federalism, for example, jurisdiction over natural resources, which for the most part are located in the provinces, and whether we're now, Saskatchewan and Alberta will be taking the carbon tax to the Supreme Court, or Saskatchewan will, I guess. And so we're in this moment of real barriers and gridlock in terms of our national climate change strategy, relative failures at the national level, and we're also seeing relative failures at the international level as well with the latest COP. And so in this context, some have been looking to municipalities and that the kinds of extractive populism, which I don't really have time to get into here tonight, might be mitigated actually or sort of circumvented by engaging in transition at the level of municipalities. So I just threw up their Renewable Cities, their logo, their global platform that's advocating a switch to 100% renewables. They make the point that globally cities are responsible for 75% of energy consumption and a roughly equivalent share of greenhouse gas emissions. Municipalities are also on the front line of weather events. So there's more responsibility has fallen to cities because their representatives are potentially more accessible to citizens concerned about how climate change is affecting their lives. And there are a few countries who have already set national targets to achieve 100% renewable energy, but there are also a number of municipalities who are well on their way or have already succeeded. So Reykjavik and Burlington, Vermont have already achieved that goal in at least one sector. Portland is another city that achieved well ahead of its target, 100% renewability in its city operations, and is now working on meeting a community-wide target as well. So there's an interesting phenomenon going on where I think because of the gridlock at national and international levels, where there's a little bit of an opening at the municipal level for energy transition, even though it isn't at the scale we would probably like to see it. So I don't know how many of you were there on the night of October 29th, 2018, when the City of Regina, the councillors, unanimously passed a motion to make Regina 100% renewable. How many? A few of you, yeah. Some of the big advocates behind the motion are here in the room tonight. I was really surprised, actually, very surprised that this happened. These are the key be it resolveds from the motion. I won't read them all. But basically, that we commit to being a 100% renewable city by 2050, that the council return with a framework on how to achieve that goal, and that they seek funding from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And on the floor that night, one councillor, Bob Hawkins, stood up and said, well, we need to do something well before 2050, something that our constituents can recognize. And so he made an amendment that passed, that the report that comes back should have 4 possibilities of new and concrete actions for improving the environmental sustainability of the city that could be considered by council for implementation by the end of 2023. So it was a really exciting night. The energy was really high in the room. It was amazing that there was this unanimous support. And I got really excited too, because as you heard from Sean's introduction, all of my research has actually been in rural areas of the province. I have no background in anything urban at all, so it's funny now that I've turned my attention to this project. But it got us thinking about how we might engage in some research that might support the movement on this motion. And so since then, I've made the argument that the motion has been steadily undermined. That's probably not a big surprise. But this was the report. They were supposed to come back to council in Q4 of 2019 with a framework for implementing the motion, getting to 100% renewable by 2050. And instead, at the end of the summer, they came back with this report, which was accepted at the City Council unanimously. And in this report, they make a number of moves to what I would characterize is undermine the motion. So the first thing that they did was they decided that they can't make an energy and sustainability framework until they host a national conference, which will happen in May 2020. So the first thing was an unmet deadline. So they're pushing off that deadline now to make their energy framework until after this conference. We're not sure exactly when it will come back. The conference has had little input or engagement from local residents. We all know about Moorgate, Patrick Moore. There are many other things I could say about the conference. I won't. Because I think the conference has actually received a lot of critical attention, which is good. But I think what is, it's great that people got upset about Moore, but in the process, what got forgotten, I think, is just the steady chip away at the motion that has been happening by some elements within the city and probably on council. So the next thing that happened in that energy and sustainability framework report, which was not the framework itself, was that they kind of redefined what renewable city meant. And so the authors of the motion meant a community-wide target by 2050, which means that it wouldn't just be city operations that are 100% renewable. It would be everything within the city running on 100% renewable energy by 2050. So I'll refer to that as a community target. And in this report, they define renewable city as all municipal government operations being 100% powered using only renewable energy. So they've really narrowed the scope of the motion. They've cut it down from being something very ambitious to something that, quite frankly, if you look at the literature on renewable cities, having a renewable city target of your municipal operations that is 2050 is laughable in the literature, right? Like most cities' targets for just their city infrastructure are 2030 at the latest. They also grouped three motions together. The impacts on autonomous and connected vehicles for some reason, which might actually produce opportunities for the labor movement. I'll talk about that later. And another motion that had come another time before council about solar-powered city buildings and the city generating solar electricity for revenue. So in the report, they talked about how they needed the participation of the oil and gas sector at this conference. Okay, so remember, we're trying to get to 100% renewable. There's nothing renewable about the oil and gas sector. You can bring down the emissions intensity of the oil and gas sector, but it's not, by definition, it is not renewable. So they said, the city looks forward to the participation of the oil and gas sector in the conference to ensure the city can leverage any innovations the sector is pursuing. High efficiency, low emissions technologies are an example of the types of innovation within the oil and gas sector that make fossil fuels more environmentally sustainable. The city looks forward to leveraging such innovations the sector is pursuing. So, and then if you look at the conference agenda, you can see some of the other players they've invited in, including the nuclear industry, which in that report they specifically say is a non-renewable example of energy production. So very interesting. Okay, so the city's been at work. The city, the councillors, I don't know exactly who, has been at work undermining the motion since it was passed. We conducted some focus groups, and by we, I mean Simon Enoch from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, in partnership with the Enviro Collective, and under some funding from the Corporate Mapping Project, which is a SSHRC-funded partnership grant that Simon and I are on, and a small little bit of money from David Suzuki Foundation. We conducted some focus groups over the summer of 2019 in the spirit of this climate change as social and economic justice policy spirit. We conducted 4 groups with 29 representatives from 27 community organizations. And this was in the summer of 2019. It was before that report came out where we, for the first time, understood that the city was conceiving of the motion as only relating to municipal operations. So up until this point, we were working with the spirit of the motion, and we were thinking about this ambitious 2050 goal, which isn't even, it's ambitious, it's not good enough, but we should do it anyways, it's ambitious. And then at the end of our research, like right before our last focus group, we found out that they had narrowed it, and we were just devastated by the news. So we had 4 focus groups with 29 representatives from 27 community organizations, asking them, what are the energy needs of your organizations and the people that you support? And the kinds of organizations that we invited to the research include organizations that work with youth, seniors, LGBTQ2S+ communities, Indigenous communities, newcomers. We talked to community associations, food security organizations, shelters, disability groups, and their advocates. And we also asked, how could energy transition and investments that might be made by the city under this renewable energy motion impact your organization and the people that you serve? So those were 4 focus groups. And then we held another focus group with the idea of just transition with 12 representatives from organized labor, both private and public sector unions. And we asked those people, how could union members be affected by transition, energy transition, and what kinds of conversations are unions having with their members about transition? So the first thing that came up in our focus groups was around public transit. So on the transportation front, we noted from organizations that youth, seniors, people living in poverty, newcomers, all of these organizations talked about how these people walk and bike long distances in our city in all weather. And in fact, many people conceive of Regina as this really car-centric city, but they're neglecting to see and understand the lives of many people who, when they have enough money, might use public transportation, but who can't always afford it, and are therefore walking and biking long distances in all weather. So just a quotation from a participant in our research: on the transportation front, with the people we serve, it's very different. They don't drive, and they certainly navigate the system using public transport as much as they can. Although I will tell you that most of the folks we serve can't afford public transit, and so they walk and they ride bicycles. Public transit is expensive, especially if you've got more than one fare to pay, if you have children along. Even discounted bus passes for people with low income and the $25 a month pass for people on provincial income support are increasingly difficult to afford as living costs increase and as income assistance is cut. According to one participant, certainly with the rental supplement being taken away, that meant a lot of people couldn't afford their bus tickets anymore, or bus passes. Another participant noted, larger granting bodies are often provincially run or provincially subsidized, and they'll subsidize cabs or bus tickets, but they won't subsidize bus passes. So we found across our focus group a lot of appetite for fare-free public transit. And we noted that Kansas City, Missouri just recently became the first major US city to adopt fare-free public transit. We also noted that, for example, fare-free public transit can be phased in. City of Victoria recently instituted free transit passes to youth, and they did so in part by eliminating the free parking on Sundays in their downtowns and diverting that money towards the bus passes for youth. So that's an example where the ambition might be to expand that, but where we could start with one constituency, for example. So affordability and accessibility of transit is also an issue for families with kids in tow. The low frequency on many transit routes in the city, the cold weather, and the expense of multiple fares were barriers identified by our participants. Fare-free public transit would improve access to good food in Regina. It would also increase access to Regina's food bank. Importantly, it would allow low-income people to expand geographically their employment searches and work sites. One participant said, that would be really, really helpful for a lot of folks that can't hold down jobs because they can't get transportation out of their neighborhood to go to work, especially not reliable or inexpensive transportation that's accessible to them. So one of the major recommendations out of our report is around fare-free public transit is something that could be invested in that would really benefit marginalized communities. But we need to not only just have fare-free public transit, we need expanded routes, we need bus-only lanes, we need increased frequency. We probably need a pedestrian-only transit hub because people also identified having to get off and make transfers downtown as also another barrier in terms of lack of safety. So we also looked at the question of safety and accessibility. Really, it was brought up by most of our participants. So we noted that LGBTQ2S+ people, women living in shelters, newcomers, people with disabilities, marginalized and racialized people often don't feel safe on public transit or on bikes or walking in our city. So a quote from a participant, oftentimes the queer trans communities, they can be discriminated against in public spaces, on public transportation, that sort of thing. So in order to safely get someone from point A to B, we'll offer them a ride. So we found that a lot of organizations maintain their own fleets of vehicles in order to get people safely to their appointments, to services that they need. And so Portland is a city that has really recognized and embraced this idea of equity in terms of their climate change policies. In an article that was published in November 19 on the website Fast Company, Elisa Kane, who is the Climate Action Manager for the City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, made clear, instead of a question like, how do we get more people on the bus, we should instead be asking more probing questions like, who can't ride the bus safely and why? And so Portland had reached this sort of limit. They had increased ridership significantly, but they started asking, like, despite new programs, they sort of capped out at a certain level. And in order to address that, they finally realized they had to ask about these questions about inclusivity and safety and accessibility. And they're really taking to heart that approach in their climate change strategy now. They see addressing the larger question as a prerequisite to reaching their citywide goal of 100% renewability. I told you that many organizations maintain fleets. They buy cab fares to transport people safely to appointments. Here's one quotation from a participant. I wish the city was easier to just walk. I feel like a lot of time people are scared to walk, especially once the sun sets. What if you get followed by someone? And I think one thing that's lacking here is pedestrian culture. So bike safety, again, it's more than just painting lines on the roads. We need to actually clean the roads so that people can use their bikes, because right now it's full of sand. It's sometimes dangerous. And then people get doored, and motorists don't see pedestrians, but they see bikes even less, so it's dangerous. And I'm worried when I see youth leaving at night on bikes. One participant also suggested that public campaigns against racism and xenophobia could help a diversity of people feel more comfortable on public transit and walking or cycling in public spaces. And of course, increased ridership would certainly help with safety concerns as well. And finally, the city might rethink its the safety and accessibility of its downtown transit hub, which again requires bus users to transfer in the middle of significant vehicle traffic and to navigate across considerable distances in some cases. A bus mall that was closed to vehicle traffic would enhance safety, minimize the distance between transfers. This mall could also be partially covered to protect from snowfall and provide heated spaces, which would make journeys that include transfers much more accessible to a wider variety of people and a wider population. So on top of that, we need investments in cycling and walking infrastructure, traffic and other lighting, snow removal on streets, that would all make the city more accessible for low carbon transportation. And here I would include not just public transportation, but walking and biking. So we also found that from the organizations that participated in our focus groups that there are a lot of unmet energy needs within the city. And a lot of people are living in tenant housing, so landlord-owned housing, that's not meeting their energy needs. These are often racialized and Indigenous people living in poverty. So some of the problems include poor insulation, leaky windows, states of disrepair. All of this translates into high utility costs, cold renters, or renters that are sometimes too hot or too cold. And of course, an increasing proportion of social assistance allowances are going to heating and electricity, pushing people to what one participant called the fringes of homelessness, to skimp on food, for example, in order to meet their utility needs. There's also punitive hookup and reconnection fees for utilities that people cited as well. So we need a strategy really that focuses on those tenants who are living in poverty and a strategy for regulating energy efficiency for rental properties. And if a landlord is going to invest in renewable energy production, in infrastructure to produce energy, we need a mechanism in order to ensure that those living in that housing get a portion of passed along to them from the savings that are associated with that renewable energy infrastructure. Many people noted that social assistance rates aren't keeping up with increasing energy costs, and there's some changes to the provincial assistance programs that are removing monies that were directed specifically towards utilities. And all of this suggests that maybe there might be some popular support for example, transforming the model that SaskPower currently runs under from a profit-making crown corporation, of which the provincial government often raids and uses for its own purposes, to a public service, maybe a not-for-profit service that would have as its goal and mandate to actually deliver relatively cheap energy for those in our cities that need cheap energy. So this runs counter again, if we go back to those three different approaches to transition, counter to the idea that we need to increase the cost of energy, which have been really at the center of a lot of environmental policy. In fact, there are a lot of people who can't afford even the minimum amounts of energy that they should be consuming. We could think about community energy sharing programs. So as renewable technologies advance, there's more potential for distributed systems of energy production. Self-generation of renewable power can or could be a key component of many successful renewable city policies and a site for ensuring equity. So as an example, community energy sharing programs coordinate bulk purchasing of energy efficient technologies and clean energy for low-income communities. This can reduce energy bills and support local clean energy business. We looked at the city of Austin, Texas, that received the United States Conference of Mayors Climate Award for its community solar program. And that program allows residents who rent or who have shaded roofs to subscribe to 100% locally generated solar energy and lock in to a price for 15 years and ensure that the benefits of that are distributed more widely. So I'm coming close to the end here. So I really don't support the NDP. I wish they would be much more bold than this, but I did have to give a small bit of credit where credit is due. So one of the things that we were discovering in our focus groups is that many of these organizations, as organizations, were eager to participate in energy transition. But as nonprofits with small budgets, they all said, like, there's no way we could ever afford this. In fact, one of the organizations told us that across their institutions, they haven't even been able to upgrade their light fixtures and install LED lights because they don't have the capital funds to do it. Okay, so this got us thinking about, well, what kind of grant program is needed if we're going to have organizations transitioning to renewable energy as well. And this is just one example from the NDP's Renew program that they announced in 2018. Of course, it's not a program because they don't hold government, don't have the power to implement it, but something similar where a loan would be provided to cover the cost of a new clean energy installation or retrofit, and where that loan would be paid back over time from the savings on energy bills would really allow a lot of folks to participate, organizations, reserves, municipalities, et cetera, to participate in energy transition. I'm not sure exactly how much time I have left, so I don't know whether I should read a quotation or not from a participant. About the capital, I find that the way it's funded typically is a startup, when it's a new project or program, and then you're expecting with that capital to sustain the program forever, for however many years it runs. There's not another capital investment if it's through nonprofits, typically. There needs to be something. We tend to build these buildings and then we do nothing about them. Then you're in the same situation as we are. So green space. Of course, plants and trees remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Green space encourages low carbon leisure and mobility, and access to urban nature increases mental and physical health of residents. But yet green space is often unequally distributed throughout cities, with marginalized communities experiencing less access to quality parks and green spaces. And something that came up in our research was neighborhoods that are downtown adjacent have a lot of surface parking lots in them, and those surface parking lots are serving people who work in the downtown. And folks are really interested in within those neighborhoods and converting those spaces into either green spaces or other low carbon leisure that could benefit the residents of those communities. And one example we looked at was in Dallas, Texas. The city of Dallas made improvements to its park and path system. So Dallas committed to providing parkland or natural space connections within a 10-minute walk of all city residents. They have a 110-mile system that incorporates a comprehensive wayfinding system, which displays connections to local landmarks, major streets, and transit stops using the same style and language as the public transit network. Really, they publish these also in multiple languages, making sure that everybody can have a legible access to green space. Okay, so I'm just going to power ahead here. This is the last one on labor. I haven't really talked about labor yet. It was a really interesting focus group that we held with labor representatives of both public and private sector unions. And I had just been in the fall to a national Just Transition conference in Saskatoon that was put on by Unifor. And so I knew that, and from some of my other research, I knew that labor unions are having conversations about just transition. But what we found is that most unions are not yet having those discussions about transition with their memberships locally. So while there may be some national level conversations about transition happening, and even international conversations, people reported that within their own locals here in Regina, they were really afraid to even bring up the topic. And so they were really actually excited and happy to be around the table together. They made the point that union members are also community members who will benefit from investments in things like public transportation and other aspects of what they called the social wage. So just a quotation there. There's a lot of workers here who make a good wage, and I include myself in that. But what we don't see are our UFCW members who are struggling, or some of our other members who make low wages, where the social wage would really benefit them at the end of the day. So the public investments I'd like to see would be free transit, because we'd see members benefit from that and make that transit inclusive for our members who are shift workers, and safe, so that a woman who gets out of the hospital at 2 a.m. can go on transit safely without fear, because that's why so many women drive. So when I'm thinking public investments, I'm thinking, how can we use the transformation, not just to protect our jobs, but to protect our communities and increase jobs? We also heard from Labour a lot of fear around de-skilling and automation that are threats associated with transition. One person talked, for example, about their trade being broken apart. And here's a quotation. In BC, we see the complete deregulation of trades and the installation of far lower paying jobs. The installer, the wire puller, the lighting installer, they're cracking apart the trade that I work in right now and bringing in workers at a 50% rate. More workers in means more work gets done. I get that. But the regulatory framework exists for a reason. There's a reason that an electrician traditionally would install a solar array. It's because you can have as much as 1,500 volts there. If you unplug it in your hands would probably disappear at 1,500 volts. So just interestingly, the city has grouped here their motion on autonomous vehicles within this Renewable Regina motion. And so I think there's a real a stake for Labour there, but also a potential opening for Labour to become involved in that renewable transition motion, or Renewable Regina motion. And many people also expressed the problem that we have in our economy, where large corporations aren't going to stick around during the uncertainties of energy transition. So at the moment that it looks like more pipeline won't be built, Evraz is leaving. And so people talked about how a just transition will require economic planning and a more active government that can expand crown corporations and support cooperative economies. Not that we've seen very good behavior from co-ops lately, but that's a particular kind of co-op. Okay, so basically we have a longer list of recommendations coming out of this research, but our main two recommendations are really that, we saw a lot of really rich things come out of our focus groups, and we feel like we only scratched the surface of equity and just transition concerns. And so our two main recommendations are that the city actually strike an equity committee on sustainability and a just transition committee that would be part of their energy and sustainability framework, and that these two committees would really be guiding the city on some of these questions and engaging in further research about how a renewable energy transition can really benefit wide, diverse constituencies in our community, and therefore also bring people along and into the project. So an equity committee that would be composed of people with the lived experience of various forms of marginalization, because in our research we only talk to people who work at the organizations, but it's important to have them there too. And a just transition committee that would be composed of workers and their representatives from a wide variety of unionized and non-unionized sectors. That's it. This is, thanks. Michelle Brass is just an amazing speaker, activist. I'm really excited that next week Michelle is going to be talking, and this is an advertisement of the next Academics for Climate talk.
Yeah, I had a question, don't get me wrong, it's great turning Sansport into a nonprofit with people on lower incomes. My my concern is though, we should be going, like, if it's cheaper energy, wouldn't people be using more energy? Or would it be something where people on higher incomes would be like on a sliding scale where they would pay more money to sort of subsidize people that wouldn't have to pay for it that are on lower incomes? Just trying to understand the reasoning behind that and how that would work.
Yeah, I think like the principle, like this is the problem, right? With the environmental policies that have gained the most traction are, really focused on the cost side. And the reality is that we have a small number of people who are over-consuming a lot, and a large number of people who are actually living in like states of energy poverty, right? So climate policy has to address that gap. And so, yeah, right, we need policies that can like penalize and incentivize those who are consuming too much to bring their consumption down. But we also, in the process, need to make sure that people have a comfortable life, right? And that they can live in a secure housing that isn't too hot, like radically too hot or radically too cold at the same time. So, like, I don't know if you're referring specifically to those community energy sharing programs, but they are targeted at low-income communities. And obviously, there's things you can do to your built environment, too, to reduce the need for energy as well. And we need to figure out strategies to invest in those things at the same time. But you're right, like, overall, right, we need to decrease our energy consumption globally. And specifically, like, within what might be called more developed countries, although I don't subscribe to that nomenclature, but yeah, we have a lot of inequality in energy consumption, and so we need to deal with that at the same time as we deal with the climate change problem.
Yeah. One of the things that I think we really have to emphasize is so many of these justice-oriented things save money. And you find all sorts of examples around the world where people who have no interest in the poor actually do the right thing because it saves the community money. Examples would be like Medicine Hat and Edmonton have tried to end homelessness by paying for accommodation for homeless people. And they find that it saves the communities a whole lot of money.
Sure, or
to do it that way.
Public health care. I mean, there's many examples like that, yeah.
Yeah, and I just, there's one, maybe point out and have your comments on how we sometimes forget to make that argument. We make the justice argument, but we don't say, oh, by the way, it'll save you money.
Yeah, the problem is the timescales are really, it's difficult for politicians to invest in the longer savings, right? That only come back after long periods of time. But yes, good point. Sometimes they don't save money though, and they're still the right thing to do.
Yeah, true. But a lot of times they do save money. And
sure.
That happens really quickly too.
I was going to add on to the first question that right now, the more power you use, the cheaper it is.
Yes.
So it's been a big problem for the new solar co-op that trying to find large projects because it doesn't pay for them to switch to solar power.
Mm-hmm. SaskPower's large power counts pay very little per unit.
Well, at least half, right?
Yeah, I can't remember the exact numbers, but they pay very little.
Have you heard the saying, less is more?
Yes.
Have you seen the latest rag that came out with our pretty premier's face on it? And 8 points all include the word growth. and having basically cancer as our model for, where you just keep growing till you kill the host. How do we achieve a shift to the idea that less is more? That growth is not more is not better. 50 shoes from China are not better than 2 made in Canada. And when it comes to energy and employment.
That's a big question, Carl. How do we do that? Well, I think actually if we did make investments in some of these public things and people had the experience of using them more, they would actually find them quite enjoyable. Like I used to live in Toronto and I loved taking the TTC. You could read while you went to wherever you were going and you never had to wait for a bus. Well, sometimes the Lansdowne bus, but you never had to wait for a bus for more than or a streetcar for more than about 10 minutes, right? And under those circumstances, I think people would use it and enjoy it. And so George Monbiot talks about basically this concept, right? I can't remember his exact words, but it's like we don't need, I can't even summarize it. But basically we could invest in these sort of public infrastructures that allow us all to access them, and we don't need to each individually reproduce privately in our homes a bunch of these things, right? That would be less greenhouse gas intensive and actually would, allow us to have a new kind of sociality that might also appeal to folks in the long term as well. So we need to start building those institutions. But that's only a part of the question. I mean, there's a lot going on there. I can't answer it either. I'm only a geographer.
So my question is quite simple by comparison. I was just wondering if you've had a chance to present the findings from your focus groups to the City of Regina, even though they might have shifted their objective. Maybe it's valuable because they haven't solicited the same feedback that you have when it comes to getting input from these groups.
Mm-hmm. I haven't had that chance yet. I was trying to work on that chance. And then because I was vocal about what I understood as an undermining of the motion, I think I may have burned a few bridges. And it's hard as a individual citizen that doesn't know how the city works or who within the city is putting what pressure on. So sometimes, I'll say the city and maybe I should have said councillors or the city. I don't understand what is going on in there or who's pulling the levers, but we're seeing evidence of, right, the intrusion of oil and gas and nuclear interests into the motion. We're seeing evidence of retreating from the original spirit of the motion. And maybe I should have framed it more like that rather than some people are doing it. I don't even know who's doing it. Somebody's doing it. But I'm hoping to rebuild those bridges.
I was wondering what we could do as individuals or groups in the city to put pressure on whoever to do what you're talking about regarding public transit. I love riding the bus, and I could list a whole number of reasons why. It's perfectly safe, you can sit there and read, you can chat, you can daydream, you don't have to worry about running anybody over or all of those things. It's lovely. And thanks to transit, I would say, not thanks to City Council or the mayor or the administration, transit has actually improved in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
There's more buses, they're running more often and so on, but we need the kind of improvements you're talking about. One good thing transit has done recently, they do have a policy, if somebody cannot pay, they can ride the bus. And they used to throw them off, the drivers, but they're not doing that anymore. So, but still, it's embarrassing to get on and say, it should be free. It absolutely should be free, and there should be much more frequent service and so on. So what can we do to put pressure on the city to do this? I don't know.
So fare-free transit is really picking up steam as a movement across the world right now.
Here.
Not yet. Florence, you haven't started yet.
I want to know what we can do to put that pressure on them.
Well, I think we would need a campaign.
Yeah, okay.
We would need a campaign, and you know, the unions were really on side with this as well. And I think it could be a really powerful campaign. Edmonton has already launched one. I know Winnipeg is looking at this as well.
It's working at the university.
Yeah, and that's not free. Well, it's paid by your,
It's a hidden cost.
yes.
But everybody has, that's why the service is better now,
Yes,
is because of all of us that's going to the university.
yeah. And internationalization of the university has helped a lot too, because a lot of people come from other places with a bus riding culture that they bring with them. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot more people on the bus as well. So I think like if there was a targeted campaign, I know the city's, you know, always strapped for cash as every other area is, but they have made a commitment around renewability, and I think that if we want to force them to take a sort of equity lens, this would be a really good first campaign.
I just wanted to comment on some of the barriers you identified for increased cycling in our city. And I think you left out, probably, in my view, one of the most important barriers. Unfortunately, in our city, if you're cycling to work, as an example, far too frequently it ends up being a one-way ride. And I think if there was pressure put on buildings, organizations to provide secure locations for you to store your bike while you're at work, I think the use of cycles would increase very sharply.
You know, it's interesting, one of the participants in our research talked about the potential for sort of social enterprise models. And this participant talked about using actually the incredible skills that his organization sees in people who use their services in terms of bike repair. These are probably people who are also stealing bikes, but who know how to repair and fix and do all sorts of wonderful things with bikes. What if we could get them involved in a citywide bike service, also as a source of employment, for example? So there's some interesting creative things that folks are potentially thinking about that I think the city could really take a leadership role on. And this approach to equity just, it's not new in North America, but it's an area of energy transition that has been neglected. And I think like it's actually, in some ways, there's an opportunity for Regina, because we're starting late, to take it into account from the very beginning, and to show other cities potentially some innovative ways forward, like that one. But I agree also with like more secure places to lock your bike up.
Just on the bike issue, I was in Mexico City almost a year ago, and on Sunday mornings, and I know a lot of other cities do this, they shut down one of the major roads in downtown Mexico, Paseo de la Reforma. And they had bike repair people there, so people were biking, they were walking, they had an exercise class, they had people on scooters, but it was just basically everybody went out, and I know a lot of cities do that. So it would encourage a bike culture and stuff like that. But my question is about planning. So in your focus groups or in any of your other research, did you look at the ways the city, like planning cities and expanding out? Because I think what we're seeing is hollowing out of the center,
Yeah.
and all the building happening in the outskirts. So that puts all kinds of pressure on how can you become a renewable city when you're continually expanding and having greater costs for transportation and everything. So did you look at that as well?
Not really. There's a lot of good literature already out there. Like it's It's incompatible with environmental goals to continue to expand, especially in the current suburban form. How to get the city to change that? I mean, they even have policies against it that they're not following. So that is a real mystery to me. I'm not an urban planner. As I said, most of my research has been rural in nature, and the only reason we engaged in this research is because our community advisory board for the grant that I'm on wanted us to look at this. And so I've kind of been stepping out of my comfort zone by moving in this direction, but it's been fun. But yeah, noted, you're right.
I was thinking about the bus issue. I think the city should transition from diesel fuel buses to either electric or hydrogen fuel buses. And if they did the stats on it, I'm sure there are times of the day and areas where you could use small buses, like almost cabs, to serve the public. And use the big buses at certain other times and areas. So I think, like, the current buses are very dirty, if you like, in terms of emissions. So, and it needs to be a transition. I think everything needs to be a transition from fossil fuels to clean energy forms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are the basic sort of principles of decarbonization. So we didn't bother arguing those because they've been well covered.
The city has developed this plan. Has the university been working on the same type of program to reduce their energy?
The university?
Yes.
Well, one of the things some of the profs at the university have been doing, they're undergoing a strategic planning process for a new strategic plan that will cover the years 2020 to 2025. And so a group of us have been meeting to really try to force some good climate targets into the report. And I don't quite want to announce we've been successful because there's one more hurdle. We've been told that the Board of Governors have already seen the plan, they've already given their feedback, and therefore they won't change it. But I don't quite want to suggest that we're home free. But I think what will be in there is a 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2025, with the view of it's a strategic plan that only goes to 2025, but in the spirit of net zero by 2050. Whether the university will actually, like what they'll do to try to get around that afterwards, I'm not sure, but we've been really on their backs about ensuring, for example, that it's not 25% reductions per capita, which is what they had in there at one point in the draft. And so I feel like we've made some progress. And that's another site, like the university's operations. And it helps to have the Renewable Regina motion there to say, look, if the city itself is planning to be 100% renewable community-wide by 2050, that includes the university. That means we have to do something about it. And I think in this context, again, of the sort of extractive populism we're seeing play out in provincial and national politics, like the U of R, the city of Regina could be real leaders within Saskatchewan on the climate issues.
The city told us that the cost for running small buses versus large buses is negligible. Anyway.
We've also brought up the idea of pushing towards a fare free goal, obviously transitioning in between that, getting there. And we brought that up to like certain people and city members and just basically been laughed at. So.
Things are changing, I know. There's a lot of laughing right now, but even in the last, I would say I went on sabbatical and then, or mat leave and then sabbatical, and in 2015 and 16, and I can notice even like a significant change in my students after that coming back versus before that. Keep on.
I really like your idea of the parking meters as a good transition help, because, yeah, like you said, it's always like a tight budget, but I just feel like if we can afford to put the stadium and other things on our taxes, we can figure out how to make transit free.
Here, here.
I think in that debate, it's important to recognize that transit is effectively free for people in cars. There are no tolls on the roads. There's very few parking spaces in the city that they charge you for. Okay, all those things are underwritten by property taxes.
Yeah.
And so to keep phrasing it as though we subsidize buses, no, we subsidize cars to a huge extent. I mean, I don't know go out and drive on the bypass on west of town. Try to figure out what the cost per kilometer is of that road, what we're paying to have, those 12 cars go down that stretch of road each day. We do that now. I think we need to keep rephrasing it in that form all the time.
That's a really important point. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wondered, does the university have investments in the fossil fuel industry? And if so, is there a divestment movement?
So we looked into potentially starting one, and what we found was that the University of Regina has a very small endowment. I can't remember the scale of it now. This was a couple of years ago we were looking at this. They do have, there's still a defined benefit pension plan for people who are over a certain age that I think that they control. That would be another place to put pressure. And they probably do have investments in oil and gas and other fossil fuels. Most investing, if it's not explicitly green in Canada, does. But because it's not like a U of T or a Harvard or something with a huge endowment. In that sense, it could be a really easy strategic win, right? Maybe there's not a lot at stake. It's just something that we haven't coalesced around, I guess. But divestment movements are picking up steam across campuses.
Just a quick comment and then a question. The question was raised about the UOR, what we're doing. We have Dr. Janice Dale who's going to speak to geothermal potential. And could you mention it in your talk?
No.
Okay, geothermal, if you go through the south entrance of the education building, there's a model built there from 1981. And they had all mapped up the drilled wells near the UOR. And the water temperature is something like 60 Celsius or something, 70 Celsius below. And there's plenty of energy under the ground for us here. Emily, I wanted to ask you questions a little bit off topic, or more, I guess, in your comfort zone. Is you've been doing a lot of work over the years here in Saskatchewan. I really admire the work you do. It's very inspiring. It's also very difficult work. Any reflections you want to share with us on having these conversations about transition, working in rural communities with labor, other groups on sort of where we're at in Saskatchewan, where you think we might be going, and what could help us to get us to a better place? Really broad question.
Yeah. So yeah, I have done a lot of work with farmers and ranchers and other folks in rural Saskatchewan. And primarily, I've done a lot of work with people who have oil wells on their land and have suffered negative consequences because of that. It's really interesting. They'll sit down and they'll start by telling you that, this is a generalization, but it's fairly across the board true. They'll start by telling you, just so you know, I'm not against oil. It's done wonderful things for our community. My neighbors work in the oil industry. My son works in the oil industry. I would never want it to go away. But, and then the sentences after that but last for like an hour and a half. And it's a long litany and list of ways in which they're tormented in many ways by the industry, or fears they have about their children's health, or a long list of concerns that folks have. So I think it's really unfortunate that politically we're in the situation that we are, that right now it's so easy well, I guess it's always been a feature of populism in Saskatchewan to have an antagonism with the federal government, but that's sort of overshadowing, like that discourse is so strong in rural areas that it's really difficult to engage on these topics right now. More so now than even like 4 years ago in rural communities, I think, because people are so disaffected by the Trudeau government, and it's tough. The one thing that was great about this research is that we didn't have to start with the conversation of, well, do you think climate change exists or not? We started with, well, the city of Regina is going to do this. What do you think about it, and how are you going to how do you see yourself in this? How could you benefit from it? If the city's going to make investments, where could those investments be made that help you? And that's just a much healthier place to start a conversation than being perceived as an urban environmentalist who wants to shut down the economy in a place that you're not from. So I want to continue to work on these sort of just transition questions, and especially in rural communities, but it's not easy times right now. And it would be really helpful, I think, if we had, for example, if Labor could get more on board and they could start those conversations through their networks a lot more. I see, a real potential there. But also if we just had more examples in rural communities of transition that we could point to as examples. If we had real commitments from our political leaders to not leave those people behind, right? People are just scared. They're just scared about what their futures are going to look like. And if you can't go in with an alternative, right, that's not something people want to engage. So we need to build up what those alternatives are, and in a way that allows people to see themselves in it and allows people in rural areas to understand themselves as still part of that project, able to stay in the places and on the lands that they've stewarded for generations, right? And that don't require, for example, massive relocation or other things. So that work needs to be done in really sensitive ways, I think.
I have a question, Emily. So you've given us a couple of examples of transitions, things happening in Texas, which we know is a big oil state. And I've heard of other things happening down there, and I just wondered if you had a sense of why. How is it able to happen there?
I don't know. These are large international cities. I'm not sure, actually. I think in Saskatchewan, the two cities are, they're not as independent from the, I think overall the economy of Saskatchewan, or at least how people still imagine the economy, is so dependent on oil and gas. Although if you look at the numbers, it's actually not as dependent as we would imagine it. But I think that, if you've got a bigger city that's more diverse and is its own sort of economic engine, you can do maybe potentially a little bit more. I'm not sure what, I haven't followed Texas politics super closely, so I'm not sure, ideologically what the landscape is like down there. But I don't have a good answer to your question. Maybe someone else in the room does.
The National Farmers Union, there are not as many large farmers as there are small ones. Where do the small ones, how do they relate to the Sasquatch? And why?
Oh gosh, these are tough questions, folks. That's going to depend on the riding, I think. But yeah, lots of rural folks are, the NDP hasn't really had a rural strategy in a while. Lots of the rural areas are voting overwhelmingly for the Sass Party. That would include both small and large farmers. The NFU's membership is decreasing, just as farm consolidation happens, right? But I think the NFU is a really important force in rural areas in terms of progressive values in farming. So I don't know, they're all over the map, but also, yeah.